name's Lauren Shapiro. I am a Miami-based artist working in ceramics, technology, in the community, and the environment. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of my background, my work, and the things that I do. And then I have a hands-on component workshop where you guys can participate by trying your hand pressing clay into molds to create a sculpture. Next. So a little bit about my background. I grew up in Coral Springs, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's a little bit northwest of here on the very edge of a very manufactured, artificial, sort of filled in Everglades neighborhood. So it was always something that was formative for me, that there was this division between where I lived and this vast expanse of Everglades marsh that was inaccessible. And so I think that paved the way for a lot of the work that I do. I started doing work. I went to the University of Miami for my MFA, where I studied ceramics and mold making. And when I got out, I really wanted to use that technique and that language of taking impressions and turn my lens onto the environment. And I've done several different types of residencies, nature-focused residencies, and scientific collaborations. This particular one was in the rainforest of Brazil, where I went out and collected silicone molds of textures and then brought them back to build sculptures and installations. One of the first ephemeral architectural works that I created was for a pop-up exhibition during Art Basel in 2017. It was called Raw. They gave the artist carte blanche in this really beautiful raw space, which is the historic post office in downtown Miami. And so what I did is I covered a clay column, a column in unfired clay textures of native and invasive species of plants. So part of the challenge was that we had to install in 2 days, and it takes a long time to build these things, a lot of labor. And I was teaching at New World School of the Arts at the time, and a bunch of students wanted to participate, and I reached out to friends, and they all came through to help me build this installation. And what happened was something really amazing. They really loved it. People went crazy. They were like, "My God, this was so amazing. How can I help you do this again?" We got that thing up in a day and a half. 3 days actually it took to create the work of art, where we're layering these sort of clay textures from molds onto the structure, where it was on display for a weekend, and then it was broken down with water, recycled, and regenerated. So this kind of like a light bulb sort of went off for me, like, oh, I'm also an educator. People really love this stuff, and there's a lot of funding for community-based projects that involve the community. And I'm trying to do large-scale works of art. So it's kind of like a trifecta. So I figured out a niche for myself where I was able to get some funding to do larger, more substantial installations like this one here. This one was Fairchild Tropical Botanic Gardens. In 2019, I created a site-specific installation of unfired clay with silicone molds of plants and flora that I collected from the garden. This was part of a grant called the Wavemaker Grant that was awarded by Locust Projects, which is a local arts organization in Miami that gives money to artists working with the community. So with this grant, I was able to go into the garden, meet with the scientists, talk to the botanists, learn about the different types of overlapping plants that happen here in Florida. We have a very unique environment where there's sort of this overlapping Venn diagram of plants. There's tropicals and there's subtropicals, and then there's temperate species. So because of where we are in the equator, it's more subtropical temperate, but because we're surrounded by a body of water, it accommodates a lot of tropical species. So what I learned was a lot of the plants that you see in Miami are not from Miami. A lot of our local and native flora have been kind of developed to make way for these very tropical, colorful kind of leaves that don't really belong here. So I found that really interesting. So here I am in the garden casting. I was the weirdo with the silicone molds, slapping them on trees and taking different type of textures. And over the course of over the course of a month, I hosted several workshops where people pressed clay into molds. I stored the clay pieces. And then over the weekend, we created the site-specific installation with the clay. And a lot of the artist community showed up to help. It was during a garden festival, so people were going in and out. They were asking what it was. And it made a really beautiful installation that after 1 week was taken apart and recycled. Another project I did at Fairchild was a Night Arts Challenge grant, where I received funding from the Night Arts Foundation to create a permanent work that would be on display in the garden. So a similar process where I hosted workshops outdoors in botanical spaces around Miami where people could press clay into silicone molds of the flora that I had collected. I brought them back to the studio. glazed and fired them and affixed them onto the tiles to create a mural that was put on display in the Tropical Conservatory for a solo exhibition. And these have been really successful. People really, really like being a part of something. It kind of breaks down these barriers between artists and audiences. You know, you go to a museum, you're not supposed to touch. It's very, very different. It's very separated, but this kind of invites people into a process, and it's a mold, so it's instantly successful, right? People get really intimidated by works of art. This is a project I did in 2020. A colleague of mine who's based at the time in California and LA, who was a professor at California State University, was going up for her first NSF grant, National Science Foundation grant. And one of the feedback that she got the first time she applied is like the outreach wasn't strong enough. And so she saw a lot of these community-based practices that I was doing and invited me to join in her research and learn a bit about coral reefs. I'm from Florida. I'm a third generation. I've spent a lot of my time snorkeling and seeing the change of our bay, of the marine life in Florida. So this was a really unique opportunity to kind of delve a little bit more into these ecosystems. And these partnerships have been really great for me because I get such an in-depth learning experience. I was able to go out with her to French Polynesia and cast some of the corals. But with this particular project, we built a site-specific installation with the community, 300 volunteers, to create this sort of lost city of Atlantis installation. And these were all impressions of corals from silicone molds. Originally, I was supposed to go out to French Polynesia to cast for corals, but the pandemic hit. So doing a giant social practice project during a worldwide pandemic, extra challenging. But what happened was I ended up connecting with a lot of our local scientists from from FIU, who were able to loan me coral skeletons to cast. And I got a really great sense of the marine biologists here in Miami and Florida. So it actually worked out really great. And then here was the installation. It was up for 8 months at the Bakehouse Art Complex in Miami, after which it was broken down and destroyed. And then disseminated amongst the artist community. It took me about 3 years to get rid of that clay, but I did it. I didn't throw any of it away. For those of you who don't know, clay, before it is fired, you can actually wet it with water and it will regenerate. Here's one of the examples of some of the molds using one of the coral skeleton species. And then afterwards, I was able to go out with Nissa to French Polynesia and observe some of her research and talk a lot with the students that she was working with and noticing a lot of interesting parallels between artists and scientists. Both artists and scientists have this sort of this practice where they're going out into the field and gathering information and going back into the lab, into the studio, processing that information, asking more like questions about how we can push society forward and asking really important questions. So that was really great for me. I also ended up casting silicone molds while I was out there of Pacific species and creating some site-specific installations on the beach. Sorry, this is like going crazy right now. 1 second. So while I was out there, I learned about photogrammetry. I don't know if anyone is familiar with photomosaics or how scientists use them, but typically in the past, I was taking silicone, taking leaves, taking bark, casting them, and then with underwater, you can't do that, right? So the way scientists measure benthic environments is they use photographs that they stitch together to make 3D models. And I have a digital fabrication process in my work where I use 3D models, CNC, 3D printing to create molds. And so that's what I started to do out there. I was swimming with a Olympus point and shoot, an Olympus Tough camera, very, very low tech, swimming around corals, taking 75 to 150 photos, putting them into a software, making a 3D model, and then using them for architectural tiling systems or sculptures. And so this became kind of a passion project of mine. Just doing, I'm a big, I love to scuba dive. I love to explore nature. So, doing 3D modeling underwater of different types of landscapes and then bringing them back on land for people to observe or to make artwork out of them. Here's a little bit under the hood of what that looks like. So each of the photographs become these pixels where they align in the software to generate a 3D object. It's a very meticulous process. It's a lot like sculpting. It generates this big point cloud of data, which you have to go in there with your cursor and kind of select and delete and choose what gets incorporated in the sculpture or in the object. And for me, that's so similar to ceramics. So it's a process that I really, really enjoy. And here's some examples of sculptures that I've created with some of these models. These tiles were based on a 3D scan of the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. Prior to my own photogrammetry practice, I was collaborating with a lot of scientists and using open source databases for some of the grant funded projects that I was doing, such as this one. Here's a close-up. So on the right-hand side is I would butcher the name, begins with a P, but it is in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. It's a sacred space for the native people there and also a scientific research facility, so not for tourists. And this was a beautiful coral reef with coral heads the size of cars. In 2018, a hurricane fueled by the warm waters of climate change just basically mowed it over. So all of those corals were gone. They will come back just very slowly. That's part of the issue, right? Is like these corals will come back. It'll just take thousands of years, right? Here's some more under the hood of how I create models for tiling systems. So this is a surface of that particular underwater ecosystem as applied to a ceramic tile. And I'm creating a lot of these with like CNC tools and 3D modeling tools. And here is another example of a coral that I scanned in French Polynesia that became part of a media installation. So this is a rotating spinning scan. I'm really, really interested, now that I've worked with scientists and understanding how empirical knowledge moves forward and how scientists work with asking hard questions and creating different types of pathways to information. I'm really interested in what happens in between those spaces, right? We think about it as like process philosophy. So traditional ecological knowledge, intuition, things that artists bring to the table, that's something that's important as well. And so with these installations, I'm trying to create that feeling of swimming in and through these data clouds in a non-empirical way. Another scan of some coral during a rescue reef expedition where I scanned, actually, excuse me, I think this was Carey's Fort Reef in Florida Keys of a restored patch of staghorn coral as a 3D animation. And then a media installation where it was projected onto a CNC'd sort of sculpture where these are kind of like rolling around in a bowl, kind of like a scrying bowl, watching this restored elkhorn coral, as well as sculptures. So all of these textures you see here were 3D models cast from molds, 3D printed, and then cast in ceramic. And I build them as part of an object series called Tidal Relics, which brings me to my project now. So all of this work I've done with the community, I have a couple of art in public places, county projects, and understanding the intensity of public art. I'm really interested in bringing these all together into a permanent work of art. So the Future Pacific project with the corals was sort of a proof of concept. Last year, I was awarded a grant from the New York Foundation for the Arts called Anonymous Was a Woman. And basically, the plan is to create 3D models of coral sourced from the Bay, sourced from South Florida, sourced from Miami, make them into silicone molds where people will contribute to the molds by pressing clay into the sculptures. I will take them back to my studio, fire them, and then these will be applied to a permanent work of art. So I've been in conversation with the Underline, which is kind of like the High Line in New York. They're really interested in placing the project on their phase 3, which is across from University of Miami. I've done a couple site visits. Everyone's really exciting, but now we need the funding. So I have tranche 1 design work, some awareness campaigns, and a video, which we're working on now. This is the very, very beginning of this project. And so what we're going to do today, if you'd like to join me, is try your hand at squishing some clay into a mold and feeling what that feels like. I'm also doing a workshop at Biscayne Farmers Market this Sunday. If anyone wants to come out and have an awesome smoothie and play with clay, I'll be out there. And this was from a workshop with the Miami Waterkeeper a couple of weeks ago where people were able to participate. So thank you very much. I don't know if anyone has any questions, but we can mix and mingle afterwards if you want to. There's not enough room for everyone to happen at the same time, but I could get you guys started. But does anyone have any questions? Yes. That's a good question. So I think with the unfired projects, before you're able to do a large scale work of public art, people want to see that you've done a large scale work of public art, which can be challenging, right? So it was a couple of strategies for me. One, I'm an educator, so I had access to students and people that were really interested in participating. I wanted to go large, and I didn't have a lot of money. So that was sort of the impetus between I started on a smaller, like that column piece I showed you. That was the first one. It was self-funded. And then from there, I was able to start applying for additional funding and working with scientists. One thing with the unfired clay is it's really immediate. People get to just sculpt onto the object, which is really cool. And that it is impermanent adds another layer to the message, right? That these ecosystems are in danger of being destroyed. But it's a lot of work and it's really hard. And I think people do get kind of depressed at the idea of these things breaking down over and over again. And emotionally, I think it's hard for us to create these types of works of art, right? It's heavy. And my passion is really to do public works of art and things that are going to create some cultural heritage. Quite often, we don't get a say in what our taxpayer dollars do, right? We're paying into this fund, this work of public art that a committee decides. And so with this particular project, I'm really interested in including the community, not only in building it, but commissioning it. So things that could help is if someone knows like a concrete company that would be interested in donating a footing, or someone who has an understanding of permits, or just if you want to come and help make some clay sculptures, like all of this kind of feeds into it. And it's about creating ownership of our shared spaces, right? Not just shared civic spaces, but our environmental spaces. And so this is kind of like probably will be the hardest thing I've ever done. As if it's not hard enough to do. We're always, as artists, we're always trying to like top the next thing. And so this is an evolution of my practice. So I don't know if that answers your question, hopefully a little bit. Sure. I think it's an interesting question working with scientists. I think for artists, there's a really interesting concept of like power dynamics between art and science. Science gets a lot of funding. Art does not get as much funding as science. So sometimes as artists, we're in danger of being swallowed by science as an educational tool. And I think that if you're working with scientists, sometimes when the stakes are a little lower, I think with my colleague with the Future Pacific Project, I was her outreach. So I was kind of performing a service, which was great, but it's not something that I want to necessarily repeat. When stakes are a little lower, there's more time to plan and ask questions that could potentially influence some of the scientific research that they're doing. So there is an interesting dynamic between art and science, but it does create some opportunity for artists to collaborate, and it's just such a natural path, right? Scientists typically need help communicating their work to the world, and artists need a platform and need knowledge and need access to that world. So I've found a really nice niche. I think a lot of us have too, being able to navigate that world. But yes, getting swallowed by science and the education piece sometimes is a little tricky. Any other questions? All right. So if there's no further questions, you're welcome to come talk to me, casually or connect. I'd love to meet you. And I'll put out some molds and just come up and try your hand at playing with a mold. Sound good? All right. Thank you all.
Don't be scared. Come close.